So challenges to in the world, okay, specifically relating to Islamic finance are the four, and I'll just introduce them here and then I'll come back to them at the end of my presentation. Okay, so first challenge to a belief system and to a system of interpretation, interpreting existing Islamic law is globalization. I mean, this is true in any religion, in any belief system. You know, the idea that people can move around the world, ideas can move around the world. You live amongst people from different faiths and different belief systems. And you also have the ability to tap into multiple identities. You know, I'm American, I'm of Irish descent, you know, I like football, I don't like basketball, you know, whatever kind of identities, we're all familiar with having multiple identities, right? Okay, so second thing that has happened in the contemporary world is the questioning of existing institutional structures and existing practices. You know, is this practice may have been around for 1,400 years, but is it still relevant, or is it still appropriate in today's world, or does it help us live in today's world, or does it hurt us? And of course, you deal with diverse political and legal systems. Regulations can change all the time. And finally, there are some, you know, situations and ideas about social justice that have to be addressed in all societies over all times. Okay, so one way, in my way of thinking, one way that many Muslims have begun to address some of these contemporary challenges is by constructing an Islamic finance industry. Okay, while there are verses in the Quran that specifically relate to business relations, there was nothing called an Islamic finance industry until the early 1970s, when basically ideas from the Indian subcontinent mixed with petrodollars going into the Arabian Gulf countries, and just an awakening in general of Islamist thought and some Arab nationalism in the Middle East. Okay, now Islamic finance is in most countries in some form, but the major regions are the Gulf Cooperation Council, that's Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, those countries on the Arabian Peninsula. Malaysia is a huge Islamic finance center, which is something that most people don't associate with Islamic finance, but Malaysia actually has a very large and very well-developed retail Islamic banking industry. And the United Kingdom, the UK, is probably the leader in intellectual development in the Islamic finance industry. In the US, we have a growing industry in the US. Chicago is actually quite a big center for Islamic finance. There are a lot of boutique firms here and some bigger banks here. And our own Devon Bank is actually offers Islamic mortgages and other kinds of Islamic finance. And we're hoping to have someone from Devon Bank here tonight, but he couldn't make it. So assets under management are estimated to be around $1 trillion. And expected to grow up to $3 trillion by 2015. So it's a very, very fast-growing industry. All right, basic principles, profit and loss sharing. Basically, this means if you expect to make a profit from a venture, you should be willing to take on a loss. And that's a really basic notion in the industry, and there are all sorts of debates on how that may or may not happen. Islamic finance tries to link the providing the finance to real economic activity. And basically that means if you're going to put your money into something, it should be put into an investment that's producing something for society. There's a lot of rhetoric in Islamic finance about fairness, equality, economic and social development, practicing your faith through business practices. And one of those 5 pillars of Islam, if you recall, is called zakat, and that's an obligatory, it's like a tithe, it's like an obligatory charitable giving based on your assets. And because zakat is built into the belief system, there are some efforts to channel that zakat towards Islamic finance and to have profits from Islamic financial activities go towards charitable activities. So that sort of idea of putting your profits into charitable activities is built into the religion and into the economic theory. And finally, what also drove me to this industry is that it's profit maximization is not the only goal of doing business. Okay, practices. Riba is forbidden, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. They're prohibited or haram goods and services. You can't trade pork, alcohol, weapons, the usual things that aren't good for you. Gambling is forbidden, as it is in many religions. Speculation is forbidden. Speculation refers to excessive risk, and this is one of those things that can be interpreted in many different ways. Okay. Every Islamic financial institution has a Sharia scholar or an Islamic scholar, at least one, and usually more, associated with the institution, and they are required to approve all the transactions, all the financial transactions. And Islamic practices are often encouraged in a business setting. From my personal experience, that varies by company. And most companies I spent time in weren't very strict about encouraging practices because a lot of the employees aren't Muslim. You don't have to be Muslim to work in the industry, and many are not. So in my experience, the practices weren't sort of too obvious in the institutions. Okay, so I said I'd come back to the idea of riba. Riba is usually interpreted as interest or usury, and the concept of disallowing interest or usury is not a new one in the Abrahamic religions, and we may talk some about that later. But it's specifically not permitted in Islamic finance. There are basically 4 verses that refer to the prohibition of riba. Here are 2 of them, and you can see that trade is permitted. So profit is permitted and encouraged, and business trade is encouraged, just not what's defined as riba. And two more verses to just show you that they are there in the Quran. For many people, having the verse in the Quran is enough. For other people, they need a little more justification than that. Okay, so riba is unearned income, unequally distributed income, any situation in which one party is clearly going to win and one party is clearly going to lose, like some of the hedging transactions could fall under this category. If the profit rate is too high or too low, that's considered to be riba. And what I mean by this is if you take out a loan from a bank and the bank is charging you a rate that's much higher than its competitors, that's considered to be unfair to you, the borrower. But if they are offering a rate that is much lower than their competitors, that's considered to be unfair to the bank. So the injustice goes both ways. We really strive to have the transaction be fair for everybody. And of course, interest is associated with exploitation, and in particular, credit cards are really problematic in the industry. Okay, reasons for not having riba. Like I said, for some people, just the prohibition being in the Quran is enough, but it's generally thought to be unjust and corruptive and demeans human personality. If you are indebted to somebody, it's thought to diminish your personality and your character. Okay, I talked about major existing markets. 3 markets around the world claim to have 100% Islamic financial institutions. But generally that does not apply to multinational banks operating in those